Welcome to the Friends of Fantasy Benefits Baseball Podcast. I am Justin Mason, lead fantasy writer and analyst of friendsoffantasybenefits.com. Joining me on the Sunday episode is Bruce Cagle Jr. Bruce, how you doing, my friend?
Wonderful, my man. Wonderful. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Football is over. Football is done. Like we are officially, Chiefs on the Super Bowl. That's over. It was a fun game to watch, but now we are moving into full-on baseball season. Ignoring any sort of football, basketball, hockey. I don't care anymore about anything else other than baseball. So I'm excited. Wrote my first article for Fantasy Pros, which hopefully will be going up sometime tomorrow. So that's really cool, especially if you like draft and hold leagues. It's a whole draft and hold primer. So, definitely go check that out. And then let's see what else we got going on. We're going to have lots of podcasts coming up here on Friends of Fantasy Benefits. Going to have my usual Monday nights with Dave McDonald, but I'm also going to be adding a Dynasty episode every week, and then another episode with Ray Kuhn on Fridays. So right now it looks like we've got like 4 episodes a week coming out on Friends of Fantasy Benefits. Hopefully we stick with that all throughout the season. And Bruce is back, right? Jay Hook is in the chat already. You can catch us live when we record on Sunday nights, on YouTube and on Twitch. Justin Mason FWFB, I think, is the handle for both of those things. It's great to talk to you, Bruce, and we're going to talk a lot about auctions tonight. And I think that's going to be a common theme for us kind of moving forward, at least for the next few weeks, because you're a big auction player. I love auctions. I feel like auctions are the best way to draft. And I feel like they're kind of underrepresented.
No, they really are. Not nobody, but it doesn't get that much airtime. And you can take a look just by ADP. 8 drafts have happened where, all the other stuff is just getting sold out quick or getting sold and ran through quick. So I like focusing on auctions. They have unique things in them that you don't necessarily find in snake drafts all the time. So it's really cool. And there was no forcing me to do the A's. That was cool. I enjoyed doing it, even though, they're lower there. But I love talking ball anytime, so it doesn't matter. I love this.
Before we jump into our auction talk, I have to pay something out right now because I've been all throughout our team previews. I talked about if you gave us a 5-star review on iTunes or on Spotify, it would get you entered in to win a free RotoWare shirt. And we got a lot of amazing 5-star reviews. I want to read some of them right now. Matty Fresh said, for those who can't get enough fantasy baseball, this is the place to be. They have a wide cast of talent on the show with different viewpoints, help you get a broad spectrum of fantasy baseball. There's so much information, my head could explode. This is a must listen for anyone who loves baseball in general. DK1545 said, Justin knows his stuff. Of course I know my stuff. You have a lot of choices in the fantasy baseball community. I encourage you to make this one you keep on your playlist. Great host, great guests, and great stuff. Mets Addict wrote, Justin is the gold standard of fantasy baseball analysis. People just sucking up to me at this point. Nate wrote, one of the best fantasy baseball podcasts out there. BLB951 wrote, terrific info over all types of leagues. Richard Zito wrote, Danielle and Dave have a great show. Justin must be lucky. I don't even know, like that. Feel like that one's a dig at me from Richard Zito. Love the team previews pods from GIF 4410. Body Bag 6 wrote, team preview podcast the best. Good to have a sense of team depth charts and playing type and keep up the great work. And then Code Rad wrote, amazing how they pump out the preseason previews in such high volume. As a fantasy baseball podcast junkie, it's a great fix. Just gets better and better. Hope they bring back the team prospect previews at some point. Talking to Matt Thompson, we're going to talk about doing those podcasts, the prospect podcast previews again at some point. And then MPJR wrote, loving these team previews, super helpful. And then Nicholas Gott wrote, of all the fantasy baseball podcasts out there, FWFB's latest might have been the most handsome ever. And that was after he guest starred or guested on the episode. And so I did a little randomizer, and DK1545 FWFB. You are the winner of the RotoWire t-shirt for the month. Get to me either via email, justinmasonfantasy@gmail.com, or Twitter DMs, and I will get you your free RotoWire t-shirt. We're going to give away one each month until the start of the season. So there'll be one at the end of February, one at the end of March. Really appreciate everybody giving us those 5-star reviews. They really, really help us out. You can do those on Spotify or on iTunes. If you do it on Spotify, make sure you send a screenshot of it to me via email or Twitter DMs. That way I make sure you get you into the drawing. But let's jump now into our auction talk. And I think the first question needs to be, how do you prepare for an auction that is different from a snake draft? Because I think a lot of people have done snake drafts. They have their way of kind of getting prepared for that. How does it differ for you when you're doing an auction?
For me, I like to really work on, I use workbooks and templates a lot. So I like to make sure I'm really organized with it. But you could go to like Fangraphs, they have an auction calculator. So I like to make sure I have values for the league I'm playing in as well, because it helps me understand where my money should be distributed or how I should maybe approach. I mean, it's the easiest for me to see it that way. So I really like values. And in a snake draft, you get to be a little bit more flexible with the values, just because you know where you're at in the picks. So if you pick one, you know you're coming back, an X amount of picks for 1, 2. Where in an auction, you got to kind of be ready, because we'll get into it a little later about player nomination, but like in an auction, it's just the dynamics are so different than a snake. So I like to make sure I'm really organized with my values and how my workbook will go for the draft.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point. I put a lot more into my prep work in terms of making sure I'm really, really organized and really ready for an auction. And really, I think a huge difference in an auction rather than a snake draft. I mean, obviously, a snake draft, you really want to know your rules and you want to know who you're playing against, right? But especially if you're playing in a home league, knowing what other people's tendencies are huge in auctions, right? Knowing who's going to spend on closers and who's not, knowing who's going to be a stars and scrubs type of person who's going to spend a lot of money early and who's going to stay more balanced. I think it's really, really important to know your league dynamic. Now, that's harder to do if you're playing in NFBC, where you're going up against 14 random people or 11 random people, depending on the size of your league, right? But if you are in a position where, hey, I'm drafting against the same guys every year. For me, Tout Wars, right? I'm doing Tout Wars auction. It's my 3rd or 4th year in this specific one. 12 of the 15 people are returning. Like, I need to know exactly who's going to spend, how often they're going to spend, and what they're going to spend on. And making sure I have good kind of concrete understanding of that is, I think, really important to have success in an auction format.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, home leagues, I find I've done a lot more home league auctions. I'm now dipping into NFBC. But the 15-teamer dynamic is a little hard to know what some people, but you do see some similar names over and over, and you can still pick up tendencies. It's one of the things that I think like you said, prep is really key. I like to prepare more anyway, but for auctions, I found myself really diving in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, and I mean, even for leagues like NFBC, so like one of the things I do is, like, if I'm going to do the auction championship, the $1,500 auction championship in Vegas, I'm going to be in New York. They're going to have a whole weekend of auctions there. I'm going to go watch those auctions. I'm going to take screenshots of how much those guys are spending, because a lot of them are going to be in my league in Vegas, a week later. And so just getting as much information about the talent you're drafting against, I think, is really, really important way to approach an auction. The more information you have, the better off you are. If you know that Jeff is going to spend $27 at least on Jose Altuve, then that gives you an opportunity to either price enforce or know that you may be in or out on a guy like Jose Altuve at $27. I'm just throwing random player, random name. I'm not saying he's worth $27 necessarily, but having that information, I think, is really key. You talked about having your values, right? Having
Mm-hmm.
that kind of said, how rigid are you to your values, right? Like some people are very loose and like, hey, this is, maybe I'll go to 27 or maybe I'll go over 27. And some people are like, hey, if it gets to 27, I'm not going $1 more. Where are you at in terms of your values when it comes to an auction?
Well, now that's like it's like a two-part answer to a degree, because like I'm very strict on, I don't want to overpay a ton at the top, because we're gonna have to pay at the top anyway. That's how it always works in an auction. But I'm really rigid on how much I'm overpaying or for who. But when we get into the middle rounds, depending on how much we had to overpay at the top, and if we're paying one or two, so like you may have to then get a little looser on some of your valuations and get, okay, I have him here at $17, but I might have to pay 20. I was looking at 19, but if we're paying one or two more, dollars there, the dollar guys are going to be a little bit better for us, and we probably can nail a few more down there. Because I'd rather go after those 19, 18, 20, $28 guys, 38, $35 guys, depending on where my values are. But my values are rigid as far as how much I'm willing to overpay. Now that might be different than what average values that have been paid, the AAV. That my overpay or how much my values are might be real different than that. So that's where I might differ live in draft, but I'm pretty strict as far as how much I'm overpaying, but I'll loosen up depending on how draft dynamics start out and how strict, how crazy people are versus AAV.
Yeah, I think I'm about the same. Like I'm fairly rigid to my values, but I'm also like I give myself a little bit of wiggle room, especially on the guys that I really like. And so, maybe I'll go $1 or $2 more, but I'm never gonna go $5 or $6 or $7 over what I think my value is. However, I will say one of the things I didn't mention during the previous question in terms of what's different, for me in terms of prep in an auction rather than in a snake draft is I think it's really, really, really important if you're in an auction, especially a live auction, to have some sort of draft software, right? To have some sort of program that can help you with inflation, that helps keep track of other people's money and rosters and kind of like give you a better idea of, hey, like real quick, I can figure out, hey, I need stolen bases or I need saves or I need this or that, where can I get that from? I think it's so like, I don't mind going into a snake draft with just paper and, pen and stuff like that. But I really do not like going into an auction without some sort of draft software. I highly recommend kind of what I consider the big three in that regards: RotoWire, RotoLab, or Tanner Bell's Smart Fantasy Baseball worksheets. I've been using Smart Fantasy Baseball worksheet, Tanner Bell stuff the last 2 years. Really, really like it. But both RotoLab and RotoWire are also very user friendly. Highly recommend spending the $30 or whatever it costs, for RotoLab or RotoWire. I think it's $17 for Tanner Bell stuff. It just makes your life so much easier at the draft table, especially to keep track of those kind of auction values.
Yeah, and see, I'm really big into tracking, so I do it regardless. And so that's why I didn't bring it up in the difference, but I think it's very helpful even for snake drafts, but it helps keep me on point and helps me just kind of cancel out noise, because I like benchmarks. I like drafting and keeping track of that stuff. So I do that in snake drafts and auctions. It's it's the key in auctions. It's really big in auctions, I think. So I agree with you on all that.
Absolutely. J Hook in the chat says he uses RotoWare tools. I don't know. I'm not sure why Justin Mason is highest auction value. Justin Mason always is highest auction value in RotoWare. Definitely, hopefully the guy who just won or gal who just won the RotoWare t-shirt wants a Justin Mason t-shirt. I'm all for that. So, do you when you come into an auction, do you have a set amount you are going to spend on hitting versus spend on pitching? Are you going to go in and be like, hey, I have my 260, I'm going to spend 180 on hitting and 80 on pitching? And if you do, how rigid are you to that?
Yeah, I usually have a pretty solid percentage per, my hitting pitching split already decided before I go into the draft or what I'm aiming for. I try to keep it really close to it. That's what I try to actually stay really rigid to. I don't want to go in there and say, hey, I'm spending, $110 on hitting, $90 on pitching, and then I'm, 120 on hitting and 80 on pitching. That's not what I really want. I want to stick to what I'm going in as. So I'm pretty rigid with that. But I do have a hitter pitcher split all the time and what I'm aiming to spend.
Yeah, I have a hitter pitcher split. I'm not quite as rigid to it. I'm more willing to be a little bit more flexible in auction with kind of, hey, maybe this auction is letting pitching prices go really really cheaply, and I'm going to adjust that way, or hitting prices are going really cheaply, so I'm going to adjust that way. The only place where I am very very rigid on that, or a lot more rigid on that, is in NFBC, right? In leagues where you can't trade. Because I don't mind like overspending on pitching in a league where I can trade, because I can trade that pitching over for hitting later on. But if you're playing in a league that doesn't allow trading, then I think you should probably stay a little bit more rigid, because you need to keep a little bit more balance than you might in a traditional auction league. So,
home leagues too, like they're different. If that's like a keeper league, you may be able to keep someone at like $2 and they're really worth $25. Now all of a sudden you have a lot more that you can spend. So your top end player might go for $65. You can't then stay rigid to your valuation, because you're never going to get that guy in your team. It's going to potentially suffer. So you really have to know your league rules on that one too. I was speaking more my rigidness, like you said, NFBC, and that's where I'm kind of aiming for. So like I'm gonna stick rigid there, but a home league I might, I definitely, depending on the settings, I'd loosen it up.
And I think that brings up a really, really good point. And I mean, this goes for any format, whether you're playing auction, or a draft or a slow draft. Know your league's rules. This happened to me a few years ago. My first full year in Tout Wars, I got put in the head-to-head points auction, and I'm not a head-to-head points player. And clearly, the majority of the league were not head-to-head points players either. And so when I ran my auction values, through my handy dandy program, like I recommend everybody do, pitching was worth way more than hitting. Like, it was unreal, like how much more important it was to get really good pitchers than it was to get hitters. And so while everybody else kept with like this 65-35 kind of split that's pretty standard for hitters and pitchers, right? 65% of their budget going for hitters, 35% of their budget going to pitchers. I ended up spending $200 of my $260 on pitching, because it was just skewed. The hitting, the points were just skewed so much towards pitching, and I ended up almost winning the league in spite of the fact I lost 3 of my top 5 starting pitchers to injury that year. And it's because I knew my rules. So make sure you know your rules before you make a plan going in. All right. Do you track your opponent's money and their open positions? Because I think this is something that's really important to do that not enough people do.
I think for me in my home leagues, I've done that a lot. In the NFBC, I did an auction a couple weeks ago. I found, I did have the board open on a separate screen, looking at it, just kind of keeping an eye on it. I wasn't so into really caring about like exactly how much they had left, but I had the board open to kind of see that and keep an eye on it. But I cared more about tracking mine individually. Once I get a little more experience, I'm going to try and incorporate keeping theirs on my sheet too, real time. But sometimes and those NFBC ones run quick.
Yeah, so I think this is a real big difference between, doing an auction online and doing an auction in person, right? So if you're doing an auction in person, you got to keep track of it yourself, right? And often you'll either have a spreadsheet up, or my draft software will do it for me, which is why I really like draft software, right? But if you're doing it online, those things move a lot quicker, and NFBC is really, really good at moving things along very quickly, but they keep track of it for you. There's a roster page with prices and things like that. So but just being cognizant of, especially in the end game of an auction, knowing who's got money and who's got positions available, right? Like, especially if you're playing in a league that only does the auction portion for your starting lineup, and you throw out a guy at $5, but no one can bid on a corner infielder for more than $2, you just wasted money. So knowing what your opponents can bid on, and how much they can bid is a really, really important way to get the most bang for your buck from your own bidding. Let's talk about nominations. I think some people just go in and go, well, I'm just going to throw out like the most expensive player, or I'm just going to throw out this. Do you have a specific nomination strategy? Because I think this can set apart some of the good auction players from some of the bad auction players.
I mean, we have in the NFBC 23, nominations. It's not that many, because then you have your bench is done on a snake draft.
Mm-hmm.
So in that one, I try to mix it up. I think you can't just do, hey, every nomination I'm going after it, because I think people will pick up on it. But then, sometimes draft dynamics matter, because, hey, if you draft like two or three players right before your nomination and you're tracking, sometimes I found, even for myself, it's hard to keep up and make sure I have it all the way I want. So then maybe I just throw out a position that I just grabbed to get some money off the board. But then if I haven't made a pick in a long time, or if I haven't acquired a player in a long time, then I might actually be throwing someone out that I really go after. And then sometimes I might throw out a player that I absolutely think is overpriced and I want to get money off the board, and see what people are really willing to do. It depends, first or second round. That kind of depends if you have the first, second, or third pick, nomination, because draft dynamics really come in there. I mean, you could nominate, a 10th round player, a $10 player. Jordan Montgomery got nominated, 4th pick. What do you do with that?
Yeah, it makes people make decisions, right? And this is, one of the things I often like to do with my nomination strategy is throw someone out there that is going to make people make a quick decision. Whether that's throwing out a player like Jordan Montgomery, or maybe like a Gunnar Henderson, who, might have some kind of like heat or helium to him. I also, I think this goes back to kind of one of our opening discussions in this podcast, which is knowing your league, right? Knowing the dynamics of your league is, really important when it comes to nominating, players, because if you know that there are a bunch of guys who want to spend money early, that are going to be aggressive early, then get out those guys that are going to cost money that you may not want. I also think there's something to be said for throwing out guys you do want early enough where that you have a backup plan, right? So like if you really, really like Paul Goldschmidt, and you're like, you don't want to hold on to him and him be the last guy of that first base tier, where maybe someone's going to go the extra buck because they don't like the next tier. You might want to get him out a little bit early, where people go, well, hey, I've got a fallback option if I don't get him, so maybe I won't spend up so much on him. So it's really about knowing the room that you're in. And if this is a new room, if you're new to that league, or you're playing in a place like NFBC where you're not necessarily going to know the people, really paying attention to kind of the flow of the auction during the auction, I think, is really, really important, right? See how many people are bidding in the higher up amounts, early on in the auction, will give you a good idea whether or not there's money being spent. And there's always lulls in the auction, right? There's going to be points in which people are afraid to spend money. Taking advantage of those times to throw out the guys that you might want, you might get to save a few extra bucks. And Jay Hook, doing a little bit more trolling, he goes, pro tip, first round nomination, any league Justin is in, should always be Nelson Cruz. I mean, that's not a bad auction tip. One of the things I do in Tout Wars every year is my first nomination is always someone I think I might be able to get for $1, just to kind of see if I can. So like one year I threw out Lewis Brinson for $1. I threw out Cedric Mullins for $1 and got him for like $5 the year of his breakout. So there's always, my first throw in Tout Wars is always a guy I think I can try to maybe get for $1 just to see if I can.
And I think I advocate for playing in kind of multiple leagues, because this is why sometimes that lull might be at the very beginning of the draft. It
Yeah.
might be the first two players. The first player, you might have the first nomination, and you throw out someone that you're interested in, but like if you could get them at a discount, maybe the room is just sitting there. You never know. But sometimes that backfires on you when you put out like a Jordan Montgomery early, or I saw Chris Sale go early too, because people have the money. So instead of going for AAV, their average auction value, it may go for $2, $3, $4, $5 more. And in the teams, those dollars really kind of add up. And I don't know if I want to spend that early right away. But like you said, if you have a strategy around someone kind of up top that you're looking for, you might want to try and go after it early when everyone is still kind of tentative, waiting for, oh, well, there's, Paul Goldschmidt went, well, okay, Pete Alonso might still go. I can grab him too, no big deal. You might grab, Goldschmidt then for like $2 under AAV, and that could really help you out.
Yeah, I think this is a really, really good point. I mean, in Tout Wars Mixed Auction, which is the Tout Wars league that I participate in the last few years, 2 years ago, everybody spent all their money super early. So all the deals were in the middle of the draft, right? It was when people started running out of money and getting afraid they weren't going to have enough money for all the players they wanted, where you got amazing deals. This is the reason why Jeff Zimmerman won that league 2 years ago, though Tanner Bell was helping him with the draft because of a family emergency. But like Tanner was able to just clean up in the middle of the draft because everybody spent all their money early. But last year, it was the exact opposite. Everybody learned from the previous year, and nobody wanted to spend early. And so you were able to get, like, I got Paul Goldschmidt, like $3 underneath AAV, and other guys that went early, like, went really, really cheap, early. And so being able to adjust on the fly kind of your auction spending habits, but also your nomination strategy can be really, really beneficial to having a good auction. Do you prefer to do stars and scrubs, so a bunch of expensive players and then a bunch of cheap players, or do you tend to have a more balanced approach and kind of spread that money throughout your team?
I try to have more balanced approach, especially in a fab league, or even in all of them, because I think balance is the way to go. It's tough to spend a ton up top on a couple of players, because then you really kind of have to nail the middle. Not so much the late end guys, because those guys are going to be fab or droppable anyway. Almost the $1, $2, $3, $4 guys I'm talking more like the $15 range guys. We are no longer in the 15 to 20. If we spend a little too much up top, we're no longer in that range. And I don't like not being in the middle rounds, because that's where I think you find some really good profit. Is around the $15 to $23 range. And if you spend 42 and 40 and 36, you're going to have to sacrifice a couple of those probably 15ers, or maybe the low 20 guys. And the low 20 guys, and in some cases might be closers, and you might really need the closers, or catchers. It just depends on your league there too. So I try to go balanced. The stars and scrubs is hard for me, because you have to hit on a lot of picks in the single digits. You have to hit on a lot of those, I think.
Yeah, I tend to be in more of a balanced approach, but I also let the auction kind of come to me. I'm not the type of person that goes, hey, I'm going to have a balanced approach for sure, or I'm going to have a stars approach to this auction. I really let the rest of the auction kind of dictate what I'm going to do, right? Because if I go in with a set plan that's very rigid, more than likely the auction dynamics are going to screw me, because that'll be the year everybody goes in with that exact same plan. So I try to let the auction come to me for the most part. I do tend to prefer a more balanced approach, because I agree, like, it's much easier to have guys who maybe aren't a ton of stars on your team, but are going to give you constant production, as opposed to having to hit from those guys that are $3 players or $2 players, that make up the bottom half of your roster. So I definitely prefer a more balanced approach, but I'm more open to kind of being flexible depending on what the auction is giving me, kind of auction to auction. Do you prefer to save money for the end game or spend more money early? So are you comfortable with being like, hey, I've got 6 players left and $7 and I know I'm not going to have the hammer? Or do you try to save money so you can have the hammer at the end of the auction?
I think, the goal is to never leave money on the table. I mean, if you leave money on the table, especially in a league that doesn't benefit, like has no benefit for you for doing that, you're just kind of losing out on potential production. I would rather have, $6 left for like 4 players, 5 players. I would be comfortable with that type of approach, because I think then I've picked enough players up top, and I might have had to pay up a little bit, but I liked those players and I like where I'm at. I don't really want to be sitting back with like $20 left and like 5 players left to go, 4 players left. I think that's probably too much, and you're lacking some categorical balance somewhere, and your team's going to suffer throughout the year from that, I believe.
Yeah, I typically try to have like when you're getting down to the end game, I want to have like $2 to $3 per player left. I definitely don't want to have $20 for like 4 or 5 players. Like that is just a recipe for either leaving money on the table or having to overspend on one player, like that clearly isn't a $17 player, but you spent $17 on him just so you didn't have to leave money on the auction. I think I'd rather, be a little bit more aggressive in those middle rounds and make sure that I'm not leaving money on the table as opposed to potentially leaving money on the table, or like I said, like overspending on a player so it doesn't look like I left money on the table for sure.
That's why I nitpick my values a little bit too. So I know those dollar targets or $2 targets that I'm really, if I need in the end game that I really feel confident that I can get. I have a nice long list of them to a degree that I feel comfortable with. So that's why I'm a little more comfortable going, dollar, couple, for the last couple of guys. So make sure you're pretty comfortable with your own valuations and you know where you're going.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it really comes down to like how you feel as an evaluator, right? Like if you know that you feel pretty good about identifying like the good dollar players, a good, $2 players at the end of the auction, then don't put yourself in a position where you're going to leave that money on the table, right? Because you're good at identifying those. If you're not, then maybe you want to leave yourself a few extra bucks to make sure you get the guys you want at the end. So I think this is a really good opportunity to be kind of honest with yourself about how good you are in the end game of an auction. If you're new, you may want to leave yourself a couple extra bucks at the end of the auction just so you have that ability to kind of drop the hammer on someone if there's someone you really want. This is also another good time to remind you that you can throw out anybody you want at any point. And so like if there's someone you really, really want, maybe waiting till the end of the auction isn't the smartest idea. It's better to leave the auction with the guy that you really want, as opposed to hope to get him at the end when someone might have some more money than you. So, like this is where like those lulls in the auction that we've been talking about, right? That at some point there are going to be times where people get really scared about how much money's left on the table. Those are sometimes a good time to throw out maybe the guys you think are $1 or $2 buys at the end. So that way you can guarantee you get them now, right? And you may end up having to spend $3 or $4 on them. Maybe it's $1 or $2 more than you had anticipated, but you're leaving the auction with them. And that auction value doesn't matter after the auction's over, right? It only matters in auction. Do you ever punt categories when they become too expensive? So this is rotisserie based question, right? Sometimes things like stolen bases, sometimes things like saves, they get really, really expensive. Do you ever just decide when you're in an auction to go, screw it, I'm just not going to pay the price for those?
No, I try not to. I think, punting is I think it's a pretty bad strategy that I've had anyway. I think it has many disadvantages in season. Whereas if you try to be as categorical balanced as possible, and you got to understand though, like if you look at, like, I like to look at the benchmarks and draft benchmarks. You're never really going to hit all the benchmarks coming out of draft. It's going to be super, super hard because, in an auction to get 2 legit closers that are going to get, enough to hit 65 saves, how much are you going to spend to get them? That might be, $50 already, and that's half your pitching budget. but then you still need some starting pitching. So that's it's really hard in that sense. So you have to understand that you may also not hit all of them, but if you're balanced enough, you can always make big jumps in points and in standings during the season because you have so many different avenues of gaining points. If we punt, we're taking a 1 point there, and that's really tough.
Yeah, I mean, I'm okay with punting if that is part of like a really, really set strategy. And I think the really, really set strategy has to be like you're going to get those things in season either via trade or via the waiver wire. And so I think it's really, really difficult, especially if you're playing in any sort of deeper auction league. Like in a 10-team league, you can probably punt
Right.
on saves, right? In a trading league, you can put on saves because you should be able to trade for them. But like even in your 12 team and 15, especially your 15 team leagues, or God forbid if you play AL or NL only, it's really hard to punt a category and then make up for it later. I think the one kind of caveat to that, or the one exception to that, is punting something like batting average, right? It's a rate stat that has kind of some variables to it. And it's not that you're necessarily punting in a way where you're only drafting guys with bad batting averages, but you're just devaluing how much you're willing to spend for the guys with really good batting averages at the table. And the idea is it's not a complete punt, right? By doing it, you're not saying that you're going to end up in last place in that category. You're just kind of taking it out of the equation and hoping that maybe with some good BABIP luck or something like that, you finish in the middle of the pack, and now you've got a monster team in the other categories. So I think batting average is the one place I am willing to quote unquote punt somewhat regularly, but only in leagues with trading, right? Again, if you're playing in a leagues like NFBC, especially with an overall component, don't punt. Like just don't punt. Because you need to stay as balanced as possible.
And I was going to say the overall is a big thing. Individual leagues, you may be able to get away punting. If I'm going to go light on any sort of category in a 5x5, I'll probably go light on stolen bases because I can still keep up if I can keep up my batting average and then the power numbers there and the runs and RBI, I can suffer, being a little lower in stolen bases where I really don't want to punt anything in pitching. I feel like that's really difficult. Now we have to understand saves with closers is going to be tough. Some teams are punting naturally because it's not going to work out for them, and that's kind of what we have. But like, I don't want to put myself in that position. I at least want to come out the draft feeling comfortable about my closers, comfortable about my aces. So pitching, I'm not really willing to punt anything, but average and stolen bases, I'm willing to suffer on. I try not to suffer on average anymore, though.
Yeah. J Hook with a really good question in the chat. I know the answer to this, but I'm going to see if Bruce knows the answer to this. He's asking, he's always wondered why $260 is the standard for auction budgets. Does anyone know? And then he also says, now if it was $420, he would totally get it. But Bruce, do you know the answer to this?
No, this I feel like I've read it at one point, but I do not know this off the top. That's a pretty dope question, though. I like that.
Yeah, so the answer, and I believe I'm correct on this, is this was the original buy-in for the original Rotisserie Fantasy League was $260, and so that's why the budget is $260 because that was they were bidding with their quote unquote real dollars at the table. So it was a $260 buy-in. And so they had $260 to spend at the auction table for their 23 players. So that, I believe, unless someone corrects me and tells me I'm completely full of shit, I believe that's exactly why it is. And it's been the standard for a really, really long time. It's worked out pretty well. Though there are leagues that use different amounts. And again, use draft software, especially if you're not using a traditional amount. So that way you can get a better idea of how much each player is actually worth. Let's talk about price enforcement because this is something unique to auctions that does not happen at all in snake drafts, right? It's the idea that, you don't necessarily want a player, but someone else is about to get a player for cheaper than they should. So you bid them up in order to force them to spend more on a particular player. Is this something you do? And how do you do it if you do?
It's usually not on a player that I would 100% not want on the team. I think that would hurt me more than it benefits me to make sure they pay $1 or 2 extra. I think I'd be a little more flustered or upset about my buy if that happened. So I at least want to make sure that I have some sort of desire if I'm price enforcing. But the price enforcing kind of comes down to my values versus average auction values. And if my values are higher than average auction values, I might price enforce more. But then I might not have to go too high because I know what the average auction value is for that player. But if my values, if my values are like, say I value player A at 12 and he's at 10, and I'm like, I may not even want him, but V's at 12, I might hit 11 anyway if it fits the team because I know the player and I know the structure of my team. I still might hit 11, and I'll take the player because I still had some desire and it fits my team and I got a discount. And then if I don't get the player, well, he paid market price for him, and I'm okay with that too because I made sure they paid market, and I feel a little bit better that they didn't get a discount.
Okay, so here's what I will say about price enforcing. It's something I do every once in a while. Well, not every once in a while, probably more often than I should. I also think it is very rarely properly executed, and
It's
can
hard.
really backfire. And I don't recommend people doing it unless they are really confident about knowing the players in their auction, right? Like if you know that your buddy, Peter is a huge Yankees fan, he's going to overspend on Yankees, and Gleyber Torres is going $4 cheaper than he should, then yeah, bump him up an extra buck and see if you can get money out of Peter's pocket. But you should never price enforce on a player that you don't want.
Yeah.
And this is something that almost every brand new auction player does at some point, right? They bid an extra dollar because they think a guy's going for too cheap, but they don't want the player. They're just doing it to take money out of someone else's pocket, and then they get stuck with that guy. So never bid on a player you don't want. I won't even really throw out players that I don't want for the most part, because the last thing I want is to be stuck with someone that doesn't fit into my plan, I don't like. And I think way too often people are a little cavalier about that. But I think it is a good thing to do if you really know the people you're drafting against, right? And so for me in Tout Wars, I know a lot of those guys, and the ones who I don't know, I can read their work or listen to their podcasts before the auction and go, oh, I kind of know who this person now likes. But if you're like in a room of strangers, or even if you're in a room of friends, you may not know what people really like. Just don't put bids on guys that you don't like, or even guys you do like but may block you from other options later on, right? So for instance, like, hey, I'm just trying to think of a random middle tier outfielder, or let's say Mike Yastrzemski gets thrown out for $2. You have him as a $6 player, right? Well, should you price enforce to $3 and make sure that the person who has them for 2 has to at least spend 4 to get them? Yeah, that's not a bad thing to do, unless that prevents you from getting Lars Nootbaar later because your outfield is now full, right? So
Yeah.
I don't mind giving someone a $4 or $5 discount on a player if it doesn't prevent me from getting the guy I really, really like later on. So I just think you need to be really cognizant of, hey, is this going to hamstring me later? And is that worth, forcing this guy to potentially, get a little bit less value? Like, okay, he might have gotten an extra buck or two, but at least now I'm not going to be stuck with a player I don't want.
Yeah, and you made a good point about your lineup and filling up positions, because in auctions it's a little different because you can't necessarily really punt till like round 25 to get your first baseman if that's what I have to do. No, like if you get stuck with one of those players that you didn't want at first base, now all of a sudden you may have to adjust your strategy where that first baseman I really wanted was a corner, but my corner infield I wasn't allocating $10 to, I was allocating $5 to. So now little things like that. That's why I think tracking your own team is very beneficial. So you know that you don't get off track too much and accidentally fill up a position that you didn't want to, or put yourself in a bind that way.
Absolutely. I didn't put this on the rundown for you to prepare for, so I'm going to throw one at you that maybe you're not ready for. Do you like to do any sort of crazy strategies in auctions? Because I'll start. I do sometimes. Sometimes I just go into an auction and go, I'm going to try something different. For instance, I've been really toying with the idea of trying to pull off a Labadini this year. And for those who don't know what a Labadini is he was a guy who was a fantasy analyst many, many years ago, long before I was in the industry. I think maybe even long before I was even playing fantasy baseball, that at Tout Wars one year spent $9 total on pitching and $251 on offense, and almost won the league doing that. I think he finished third, but only a few points out of first place. And because the pitching pool is so deep this year, I've been toying with, hey, do I want to maybe try this? Any kind of off-the-wall strategies that you sometimes go, I'm going to try this out?
I mean, they're more with keeper leagues because I have a little bit more to spend, so I can get really aggressive and then go kind of low later, or maybe trading leagues. I have a home keeper league that has contracts with it, so I'll be willing to go, kind of real nutty and do some things. I was, J-Hook, I was thinking kind of very same. I was thinking it was a very expensive hypoallergic dog as well. But no, I think for NFBC, I think I'm trying to not necessarily go super crazy. If it would be more or less, how my roster was constructed. Maybe I go for 2 catchers that I, pay up for that I wasn't thinking of, or maybe I got the 2 top end closers that I wasn't quite going for, or maybe the roster construction's a little bit more off the wall. Like I have Carlos Rodon, Tyler Glasnow, and Clayton Kershaw as my 3 pitchers. Right, exactly. Why do you make the face? Because they're never going to pitch, but in the off chance they do, like that's that random strat. Like if they pitched X amount, like you might make it work depending on what you have planned in the back. But then that kind of comes to your point of you need to know who you have and if you're confident in some of your player analysis or some of your targets. Where I might only do that if I feel the flow of the draft is working well too, where I might, get those 3 and 2 top end closers that I think are, really legit. Now all of a sudden my pitching staff might be good, and yet they also might really crash and burn and ruin the team. But if they don't, what happens with that pitching staff? It's sexy. But that's like maybe the only crazy strategy in NFBC I would go. And that's more of like a injury risk scenario.
Yeah, I tend to only do these kind of strategies in places where, one, I don't need to keep balance, right? So a place that is a standalone auction, with trading, right? So if you're going to go heavy, hitting or heavy pitching or do something kind of crazy, you have the ability to make huge moves in season with trades to kind of help offset it. So I'm not going to do that in an NFBC league. And I'm not going to do it in a keeper dynasty league for the most part too, because I think those things can potentially hamstring you in future seasons, right? Because you're carrying these teams over. So I think in standalone auctions, I'm a little bit more willing to kind of take a gamble and kind of see, hey, can this work? Especially because I think when you do something like that, for instance, going back to the Tout Wars head-to-head points league, when I spent $200 on pitching and $60 on hitting, it really threw off the auction dynamics for everybody else in the league because they were expecting me to spend kind of the reverse of that on my hitting and my pitching, and it threw off all the prices for them. And I was the only one who was kind of prepared for it because I knew I was doing it going in. So I don't mind doing that, but I think you need to find the right places to have kind of off the wall strategies.
Yeah, that's correct. I think standalone leagues, you have a little bit more, freedom to do that. Trading leagues, I mean, the contract leagues are crazy too. Like if a player has a contract and they're going free agency next year, depending on you might get a huge haul for that, and that might throw off some future years for the league as well. And FBC is a little different where overall components and stuff like that in some of the leagues, you got to be a little more mindful, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Anything else I forgot to ask you or that you want to talk about in terms of auctions for kind of our auction strategy episode?
No, I think I gave out some really terrible hitter pitcher splits earlier in dollar amounts. I don't know what, I think I misspoke, but don't listen if I gave out dollar amounts that was like 110 and 90. That was terrible stuff. Like but no, no, I think this was fun. It was a blast talking auction stuff with you.
Yeah, and we're going to do some more auction stuff. Also, if you have questions, feel free to submit them to me, justinmasonfantasy@gmail.com. If there's certain topics or things you want us to talk about, or you have questions about like, hey, how do I approach this strategy or this kind of thing, especially for auction leagues, definitely hit us up. You can hit Bruce up on Twitter. Where can people reach you on Twitter there, Bruce?
BCJR Fantasy at Twitter. I mean, you can tweet me, you can DM me. It doesn't really matter. I'll get back to you. I like helping people figure some values out and stuff. So
perfect. And you can reach me on Twitter at Justin FWFB. You got anything else going on content wise?
No, nothing yet. If you have anything you want me to write about, just let me know. I don't mind. I like to I'm sitting back doing my own little aggregate projections, getting ready for, I think I'm gonna try and hit up another auction this upcoming weekend. I like prep. I mean, I'm busy doing that a ton, so.
All right. You can reach me on Twitter at JustinMasonFWFB. Email me the show, friendsoffantasybenefits@gmail.com. Keep those 5-star reviews coming. Really, really helps us out. You can still sign up for TGFBI satellite leagues. Potapalooza is coming up in 2 weeks' time. It's going to be an absolute blast. And guess what? Bruce is going to be on, and we're going to be talking auctions on that, on Bruce's panel. And then let's see, I'm writing daily at Fangraphs, and I'm writing multiple times a week at Fantasy Pros. And I'm on the Sleeper on the Bus podcast, TGFBI podcast, and of course, the Friends of Fantasy Benefits podcast. For Bruce and myself, thank you for listening. Have fantastic baseball off season.